covering the Cold War. This first video, we're really just going to be talking about the escalation of US-Soviet tension. So let's bring ourselves back to World War II just for a second to get a sense of why the Soviet Union and the US, but in a broader sense, the Soviet Union and all of Western Europe as well, are experiencing some tensions here. Before the war even started, just as a reminder, Germany and the Soviet Union entered into what was called a non-aggression pact, which basically meant that they wouldn't go to war with one another. This pact was supposed to last for 10 years, but it did end up ending because the Germans broke it and invaded the Soviet Union. But I think what this signifies is that the Soviet Union wasn't really to be trusted because they were willing to engage in a sort of an alliance with the Germans. And going even farther back, if you remember World War I, the Soviets entered into a separate peace with Germany so that they could get out of the war early due to the Russian Revolution. And so in general, even though the Soviet Union is allies with the West in World War II, there's this general legacy that they could break with their Western alliance fairly easily. The Soviets also have reasons to be upset with their Western allies. In the early stages of World War II, most of the fighting was taking place on the Eastern Front. So basically, the Soviet soldiers were really bearing the brunt of a lot of the German aggression during the war. The Soviets were trying to get Western Europe to open up a Western Front to sort of ease the amount of destruction that the Soviet Union was experiencing, and the Western powers really delayed that opening of the Western Front. And so that doesn't happen until 1944 with the D-Day invasion. And so at that point, the Soviet Union experienced a lot of destruction due to the Second World War, and that caused them to be sort of bitter at Western powers. In addition to that, we're going to see that after the war is over, in a U.S. sense specifically, the Americans are trying to sort of return to, again, sort of a normal domestic life. They're trying to enjoy the revitalized national economy. And they, again, feel a sense of sort of superiority to the rest of the world. Again, the U.S. sort of takes credit for winning the war, partly due to the fact that they utilized the atomic bomb to get Japan to surrender unconditionally. Additionally, the U.S. has a major role in setting peace terms. And there's also just a general fear, at least at the beginning of the end of the war, that an economic depression could return to the U.S. And so we're going to see that the U.S. takes a very active international stance in terms of economic policy. They're working very hard to make sure that Europe recovers very quickly from the war. And the Soviet Union is going to resist that because these economic incentives to recover from the war are seen as instruments of capitalism. And as we know, the Soviet Union has a communist economy. So basically, the Soviet Union is going to see this U.S. economic presence in Western Europe as a threat. So what we're going to see is that even though the Atlantic Charter, which was this set of post-war goals that was drawn up by FDR and Winston Churchill, even though in many ways the Atlantic Charter sort of mirrored a lot of Woodrow Wilson's ideas with the 14 points, so things like self-determination, we do still see that effectively there are going to be spheres of influence that emerge after the Second World War. So in other words, even though there's this idea that countries can set up their own governments, basically Western Europe is going to have increasing influence over some areas that were previously affected by the Second World War, and then the Soviet Union is also going to have its own sphere of influence. So as you can see here, and this becomes even more tangible once NATO and the Warsaw Pact are formed, the Soviet Union effectively has its sphere of influence over everything west, or rather east, of East Germany. So Czechoslovakia is basically under the influence of the Soviet Union, Hungary, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, and of course all of Russia. And so what this is going to mean is that the Soviet Union is going to try to keep these countries away from capitalist development. They're also going to try to ensure that their governments are communist in nature. We also, if you remember the If you remember the Yalta Conference towards the end of World War II, one of the things that Stalin said he would do after Yalta was that he would guarantee democratic elections throughout Eastern Europe. While these elections take place, Stalin manipulates them so that communist dictators are elected in these Eastern European elections. So again, he violates that idea of self-determination that the Atlantic Charter was providing for. So in countries like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all these countries are going to have communist dictators rise. And so effectively, the Soviet Union is going to have major influence over Eastern Europe. So again, they're violating that sense of self-determination. This also is going to allow the Soviet Union to effectively have this communist buffer zone between itself and Western Europe. Another thing that's really important is that the Soviet Union is in virtual economic ruin after the Second World War. And you're going to see that Western Europe is going to get much more aid to rebuild its economy after the war is over. So that's going to contribute to sort of a divide between East and West as well. Another provision that Yalta provided for was the division of the defeated country of Germany, right? So Germany is going to be occupied by all of the countries that fought against it in the Second World War. So at first, Germany is divided into 4 different zones. So basically all the powers that fought against Germany get a little piece of it. So you can see here on the map that Germany is divided into a zone that is Germany, rather, is going to be divided into 4 zones after the Second World War. And what we see happen is eventually the Western zones, so Great Britain zone, the US zone, France, they are all going to merge together and effectively become West Germany. But the eastern portion, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, is not going to merge at all. And we're going to see that there's a major difference between East and West Germany. Eventually, the western zones of Germany are going to become very Americanized, but the Soviets are going to try to drag capital equipment out of East Germany. They're going to impose a totalitarian regime over the inhabitants there. And in a lot of ways, what the Soviets are trying to do is to prevent Germany from recovering economically. And that way they, again, have this little buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. The other thing that is happening is that the capital of Germany, Berlin, is in the middle of the Soviet zone, but the capital is still also divided into 4 different sections. So again, there's a West Berlin, which is influenced by Western Europe and the US, and then there's an East Berlin, which is influenced by the Soviet Union. The Soviets are going to try to get the Americans out of the city of Berlin altogether, but the Americans, the British, and the French are going to refuse to give up their assigned sectors of the city. So we're going to see how the division of Berlin is going to increasingly lead to tension between East and West as the Cold War goes on. One of the really positive achievements of the Cold War is that the United Nations was created, which in many ways was a realization of Wilson's attempt to get a much more cohesive League of Nations formed. So basically, what the United Nations was supposed to be was a collective security agency to try to ensure that international peace remained. Ultimately, one of the very important elements of the UN was a Security Council, and essentially the Security Council was meant to act on essentially the decision about whether or not to go to war. There were 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Again, all pretty prominent participants in the Second World War. So the US, Britain, France, and the USSR and China. So actually, what did I say? I said 4. I meant 5 permanent members of the Security Council. All 5 of these countries had veto power. So basically, if the members of the Security Council were trying to go to war somewhere and one of these countries objected, then that war wouldn't happen. The UN also was pretty successful in establishing humanitarian relief in war-torn areas, for example. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, were established as as essentially sort of collaborative agencies that work together with the UN to provide aid to struggling parts of the world. What we do see, though, is that not all members of the UN are going to ultimately participate in the World Bank. The Soviets, in particular, choose not to participate in the World Bank to rebuild war-torn areas, partly because they think the bank is an instrument of capitalism. In terms of Cold War ideology, it's important for us to realize that the threat of communism is very real for Western countries, and this is going to start to cause Western leaders, and we're going to really focus on the US here, to articulate policies to try to stop the spread of communism. So in the case of the United States, and working in tandem with Great Britain in a lot of ways, the policy of containment is formulated. And so in a lot of ways we should think about the analogy between communism and almost like a virus or a communicable disease, right? The policy of containment sort of articulated the idea that communism was effectively a virus, and it would continue to spread if it was not treated, or if there was no sort of quarantine effort that took place. So basically the idea was that you needed sound government policies, and you also needed public support to stop communism from spreading. To a certain extent, the policy of containment was inspired by a speech that Winston Churchill gave, actually shortly after he stepped down as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So this speech was called the Iron Curtain speech, and essentially he was likening communism to a very strong iron curtain that was descending across the continent of Europe. So I'm just going to read a couple of lines from his speech to give you a sense of what he's talking about. So, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. The safety of the world, ladies and gentlemen, requires a unity in Europe from which no nation should be permanently outcast. So in other words, he's already talking about how the Soviet influence has descended upon all these areas of Europe. And basically the idea was that we needed international collaboration within all the areas that lay west of this Iron Curtain to try to stop the Iron Curtain from pushing any farther west. So basically we're going to see that Churchill calls for this partnership between Western democracies to halt the expansion of communism. And this is going to lead to the articulation of the policy of containment, which was which was laid out by that Secretary of State at the time, George Kennan. And this policy of containment basically says that if you stop communism from spreading, it will eventually cause the Soviets to back off, and this will so-called curing communism. Don't think about it as pushing communism back, but the idea is to just stop it from going any farther westward, right? So basically, we will see that the policy of containment allows for providing military assistance to stop communist revolutions from succeeding. And this will eventually lead to Truman's own interpretation of the policy of containment, and that is called the Truman Doctrine. So effectively, the Truman Doctrine stated that the U.S. could intervene in other nations to stop them from falling to communism. All right, so essentially this means that the U.S. can intervene in a military sense if there's a danger of another region becoming communist. And the first test of the Truman Doctrine took place in Greece and Turkey, which at this time were experiencing civil wars between a potential communist dictatorship and more of a democratic government. And so what the U.S. does is it pumps a ton of money into the civil wars in Greece and Turkey in the favor of capitalism. Okay, they put $400 million into these civil wars. They are effectively successful. We will see that Greece and Turkey do not fall to the totalitarian communist regimes. And because they're successful, the Truman Doctrine ends up gaining support in a bipartisan way. So both Democrats and Republicans are going to be okay with the Truman Doctrine because it seems to work to stop communism from spreading. Another way that the Cold War is attempting to rebuild Europe was to try to pump a lot of money into its infrastructure to rebuild the industries throughout Western Europe. And actually, the Marshall Plan could have extended farther east. So what the Marshall Plan does is it's a $13 billion plan to rebuild Europe. In part, it's meant to relieve suffering. It's also meant to try to reduce the likelihood of a communist takeover if the economy of a region collapses. So basically, they feel like there needs to be a lot of economic growth in these areas of Europe because otherwise they might turn towards a communist alternative. The idea was to revitalize the European economy. And the Marshall Plan was not limited to Western Europe. The US actually did offer Marshall Plan aid to the Soviet Union, but they refused. And again, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union did not want Marshall Plan aid was because they were scared that it would make them dependent on the United States and they wanted to continue their communist government. So this cartoon sort of represents this. The net is the recovery of the entire continent of Europe. This is Joseph Stalin pushing the Marshall Plan away. We do see effectively that many countries in the West end up gaining a lot of aid from the Marshall Plan, but the Iron Curtain countries do not receive this aid. So basically what we see is that there's going to be more of this sort of us versus them mentality that develops between East and West. And the areas that gain Marshall Plan benefits are going to have a more tight allegiance to the United States. Another way that the Soviet Union tries to stop U.S. influence is it issues a blockade into the city of Berlin. As you remember, the city of Berlin still is divided up into zones, so there is a Western presence in Berlin, even though Berlin was in the eastern sphere of Germany, right? So what happens is the Soviets try to basically starve the Westerners out of Berlin by cutting off land access into West Berlin. So basically this made it so that it was very difficult to get supplies into West Berlin. They were actually trying to get the citizens to become so desperate that they might turn towards Eastern aid to be able to survive in Berlin, right? So basically the idea was that the Soviet Union is trying to get all the Westerners out of Berlin, but what ends up happening is instead of taking a more overt military action, the US decides to airlift supplies into Berlin since it can't get in via land. So this is called the Berlin Airlift. This starts in 1948. It continues for several months, and hundreds of thousands of airplanes end up going into Berlin, dropping off supplies. This is an image of children celebrating the arrival of a plane that's giving them supplies. I believe one of the things that the plane is giving to them is chocolate. What this does is it first off gives people in West Berlin, significant hope that they will continue to receive aid from Western powers. It's going to make it less likely that people in West Berlin are going to want to turn towards the Soviet side. And it's also very successful in giving Truman a good reputation. And so that very year in 1948, there's a presidential election and Truman wins. And many people say it's due to the success of the Berlin airlift. So basically, since the airlift is a success, the Soviets eventually lift the blockade, and there's going to be continued land access into West Berlin. Two more slides here before we end this video. Another important accomplishment of the Cold War is that NATO is established. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and what this is an alliance of nations that are against the Soviet Union, that are against the communist regime that we also see in Eastern Europe. So the idea was that if there was an attack on any members of the NATO alliance, that it would be considered an attack on all of them. So again, this is a much more permanent sense of alliances between these countries. This also sort of breaks the precedent that the U.S. had followed previously, because as we know, before World War I and World War II, the U.S. was much more antagonistic towards allying with European countries. So we do see that the first Supreme Commander of NATO was Dwight Eisenhower, who will become president in 1952. We're also going to see that because of NATO, there are going to be U.S. troops stationed throughout Western Europe, and the idea was to try to deter the Soviet Union from invading. We're also going to see that because NATO is formed, it shows us that the containment policy is also going to lead to a military buildup. And also, there are going to be major military commitments abroad to try to stop the spread of communism. Now, the Soviets respond with their own alliance. This is called the Warsaw Pact. And so basically, the Warsaw Pact was an alliance between all these countries that were east of the NATO countries. So this map effectively shows you the divide between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It's important for us to remember that there are these in-between countries that don't join either side, and so technically these countries are some of the most vulnerable to the spread of communism. And also the divide between NATO and the Warsaw Pact make this divide between East and West seemingly more permanent. And the last element of this video is that the Cold War also sees the beginning of a major arms race. The American policy of containment again, means that there has to be some sort of way to stop communist expansion by military means. So we're going to see a major stockpiling of nuclear weapons between both the East and the West. As we know, the United States proved that it had nuclear capability by successfully dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan at the end of World War II. So as a response to this, we're going to see that the Soviet Union also builds up their own weapon supply. This graph shows us how the Soviet Union may have a slightly later start in stockpiling weapons, but it certainly significantly makes up for that in later years. We're also going to see that there isn't really, at first, a policy between either the US or the Soviet Union to control the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. The idea behind the stockpiling also was not to actually use the weapons, but to sort of use intimidation powers. The idea was that you build up all these weapons, but you're never actually meant to use them. So this cartoon here says, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. This is something called mutually assured destruction. The idea was that both sides kept building up weapons, never with the intent to use them because they could completely obliterate the other side. So almost think of it as like a game of chicken. So basically within a few years, both sides, both the US and the USSR have a stockpile of nuclear weapons. The US also develops a hydrogen bomb in 1952. So we see an advancement of military technology. Okay, so the next video that we will do is going to talk about Cold War policies in Asia. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.